All right, we should be live. Welcome back, everybody. This is the Canis Society live stream for April 4th of 2020. We have nothing better to do than live stream because we're all stuck in quarantine. So here we are um, for the second consecutive live stream where anything actually gets done. We've got a good treat, got something of a treat for you guys today, I guess, because we're going to actually be talking about things and not just rambling about ourselves. Today we are covering, well, what are we covering, Andrew?
The books. Oh, am I coming through?
Yeah, should be coming through.
Yes.
I'm looking at the stream and it's not saying I'm showing anything. I don't know. Oh, no,
We can hear you loud, clear.
Oh no, the stream's lagging. That's why.
Oh,
Okay.
it will
No,
lag. There's a little bit of
yeah, no,
latency.
I confused myself for a second. I've completely derailed it. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. Okay, no, yeah, the title of the book today is shows about nothing: nihilism and popular culture by Thomas S. Hibbs. A little bit of background about the guy. I think he's actually the president of a college. I think it's actually, yeah, I know it's in Texas. It might be the Dallas College. Uh, Currently working there, philosopher guy, mostly focused on like Aristotle and Aquinas, things of that nature. Kind of illustrated in the acknowledgments in the background in the book. But the little project, and this is, I think, first released in 1999, was the first edition, and it's been updated ever since then. But the point of that was actually from conversations with his students into trying to get them to be a little bit more reflective when they're watching movies and noticing underlying themes and philosophies in movies. So instead of just turning your brain off, going, "Oh, these are the underlying premises of the movie. This is like the meta narrative that's going on behind it." And then you can kind of see, argue, and reflect upon it a little bit more. So that's how it kind of went about. And what he noticed is that there's a kind of underlying notion of nihilism in Hollywood movies. Not all of them and not through all of American society, but enough to be noticed. And this is a little bit of an engagement with that.
Okay, and I just looked it up, so I can give you guys the information straight from the horse's mouth. He is University of Dallas, Thomas S. Hibbs.
Okay.
You guys with me?
Yeah, we're with you.
Okay, awesome. So what I figured we would do, just to start out, Andrew, since you have the book and it was your recommended read, I would suggest that you sort of lead us off with maybe some of the information that you'd like to read directly from the book, if you want to read an excerpt or something, and then
Uh,
that could lead us into our discussion.
sure, no. Since we only, in the process of doing this behind the scenes, we're also basically recording audiobooks to where this is going to be read out and it'll be put up on the Canis Codex. Like I've already got where we got up to about 15 pages in on recording. It just needs to be edited. And then I probably would want to get up to the first chapter before uploading it. So trying to
Right.
figure out the scheduling on releasing stuff first, ideally, to where people can listen to it and have the material before the streams. That would be the ideal, but it's trying to work that out to have something be a consistent stream whilst putting out, audiobooks where I'm not just stuttering the whole time. Uh, so it's really only the first 15 pages. So because this is a little bit bootstrapped, I'm kind of wanting to just go almost page by page, refresh my memory by like quickly skimming it to see what is being talked about and trying to represent it a little bit. You also, I sent you pictures of all 15 pages, so we can kind of do it. I'm going to skip over the preface because the preface is really something that was tacked on later. It's literally just an FAQ to answer little questions. Like the first one is, what is nihilism? Are there types of stories that look nihilistic but are not? Is American culture nihilistic? All those kinds of things. I might turn back and reference them as need be as we kind of go through this a little bit, but I'm just going to kind of start off on the first page.
Well, if I may, I actually think those things are included in the preface. I think because that might be a helpful place for us to start. Uh,
Okay.
you know what I'm saying? So I think maybe before you do that, we should try to back up and maybe define some of our terms. So,
And we can go through it.
when Hibbs is talking about nihilism, what does he mean by nihilism? What does he mean by American culture is nihilistic or is not nihilistic?
That's fine. All right, so yeah, I'll just go down it point by point here. So the first question is, what is nihilism? And he's using a very standard definition of it as just meaning, from the Latin nihil to mean nothing. Uh, and he's defining it as it's a philosophy or a state in life characterized by a lack of meaning or purpose. In here, he's talking about like there's no means of distinguishing between good or evil, better or worse, noble and base. Next, he starts going into like this obviously undermines things as far as like if it's a state in life versus also philosophy. If it's a philosophy, it just would say outright no, these things aren't real. If it's talking about, he likes to use traditional values. I kind of throw that out the window. I'm being slightly sneaky when I do this and just say values. Politics completely falls apart because we have no means of discerning what is the proper, just either political policy or political system, because nothing could be distinguished within it. And then he goes on a little bit to describe that he's primarily working from Nietzsche, and he's deriving this from almost a kind of Platonism, where it emerges out of like the Platonic ideal world, and this is also where Nietzsche is getting a little bit of his let's say resentment towards Christianity, where Christianity presents the ideal world, the world as it should be, and we are the fallen world, we're not as it should be, and this kind of distinctness in kind of a void between the two is where nihilism kind of emerges from, because there's this infinite chasm to try and cross.
I see. So, yeah, could you draw that out a little bit more? Because I myself, when I was reading this, I had a hard time. I could understand the logical jump or the logical how you draw this conclusion, but I want to know more about sort of the way that I think it's Nietzsche he's talking about posits that this sort of two worlds mythology, so to speak, generates nihilism. Is it just the fact that there's no way to, like as Plato would suggest, get from the world of the cave to the world of the forms?
Oh, no, no. What we're talking about here is when Plato's talking about like the world of the forms, he's saying that is the real. The chair in front of you is real insofar as it's participating in chairness, so to speak. This is a really bastardized version, I admit, but it illustrates the point. Where he's saying that's not real, that's the shadow. The point is to get towards the real, the actual contemplation of the forms. So that's presenting the world as it is as a shadow. It's not quite real. This is why you could get out of like the Gnostic heresies this kind of line of like what is it, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gnostic Gospel, where it's actually using Platonic language. It's actually using Platonic philosophy within itself. And you can kind of see how it emerges from where, okay, the material world we're inhabiting is just a shadow, it's fake, it's not real. And the real world is this something beyond, this perfect, idyllic, yada, yada, yada. And to put those things in distinction from one another creates this kind of vast chasm where, okay, if this isn't real, then who cares? But then if you start running into the problem of, well, the Platonic world doesn't exist either, which, Plato was actually trying to figure out was it real or not towards the end of his dialogues of the interaction problem. Just to really summarize it,
Right.
to where if that's also into question, but we're also left with this world that just we understand as just being kind of a shadow, then that's when nihilism starts to creep out, where it's just, well, then how do we know anything? How do we judge things as facts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Okay.
So that's a little bit of an upshot from it.
So would it be helpful? Maybe it's not helpful to try to distinguish between like existential nihilism, where it's sort of like nothing I do matters, my life has no purpose, that sort of thing, as opposed to like maybe I guess what would be called ontological nihilism. It's like nothing really exists, nothing is real, like that sort of thing. Or maybe that's not a helpful distinction to draw.
Not familiar with any kind of strict distinctions along those lines. I know in the text, Hibbs makes a distinction between active and passive nihilism. There's a little bit of a distinction there, but that comes a little bit later as he explains what those two things kind of look like.
Right. We could talk about that later. I don't want to bog you guys down. Um, so
Right.
then, so we've talked about nihilism. Um, and what was the next point he hits? I think it was nihilism in culture.
No, he's actually going to something a little bit more perking to the audience's interest, if I am to estimate them correctly. Towards the ends of the first question, he illustrates that Nietzsche's conception of nihilism actually cuts more deeply than this. He associates it with democratic liberalism as well as Enlightenment science, and that makes people kind of step back a little bit, especially the first time reading him. That leads into the next question he asks: is what are the sources of nihilism in liberal democracy? It's actually a short bit. I can actually just read it here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Nietzsche thought that democracy had a leveling effect that was hostile to human excellence and sought to reduce everyone and every aspiration to a least common denominator. A more politically astute commentator on liberal democracy, the great French political theorist Alexis de Tocqueville, saw liberal democracy as predicated on two principles, liberty and equality, that are not always in harmony. Like Nietzsche, although in less dramatic fashion, he worried about the way egalitarianism might curb liberty. Both principles, unmoored from one another and applied incorrectly and inordinately, can be sources of nihilism. Insofar as freedom comes to be understood in terms of autonomy, it opens the path to nihilism. If free choice is regarded as the highest value, then there is no standard in light of which we can appraise choice. The same can be said of certain forms of equality, not equality of opportunity or equality before the law, but equality of opinion. If, in a sort of relativistic manner, every opinion is regarded as equal to every other opinion, then there is no basis for distinguishing between better or worse, true and false, noble and base opinions. That's where you can kind of see the Nietzschean analysis of Enlightenment democracy, where for upholding the kind of for us, what we like to do is make the distinction of actual freedom and then the idea of liberal freedom. It's the freedom of autonomy. It's the freedom of you cannot restrict my acts, not the kind of freedom from kind of thing, as we might say, like the freedom from sin, or like to quote Augustine, a man has as many masters as he has vices. So it's like that kind of freedom, the true freedom to act unmoored from anything that restricts, you from fulfilling true being, so on and so on and so on. But here, if you do place human liberty, the human autonomy, as the highest value, and everything else is below it, well, then, like the value of life over death, of like values that would play into us understanding you don't get to murder people, well, then we immediately have a little bit of a conflict here. And people will be able to get out of this by saying, like, the non aggression principle. Well, then if you start putting that has to be over and above autonomy. So you kind of see where the problem lies in here, is that if you do not order it correctly, and if they come to rub against each other, well, then it starts making the entire framework questionable. And when the entire thing is questionable, nihilism has an opportunity to reassert itself, where you just say, if it's inconsistent, it's just kind of nonsense, well, then how do we judge things?
Right. I understand Nietzsche's critique of liberal democracy, at least the uh, sort of, which I guess actually it's not Nietzsche in this excerpt. We're talking more about de Tocqueville's observation, uh, sort of the leveling effect, and then further on the analysis the Nietzscheans can give it, that this sort of leveling effect can contribute to nihilism, where no one's opinion is inherently more valuable than anyone else's opinion. My question is just like, is this something that is inherent? Like, is there something inherent in democracy that makes it backslide into nihilism, or are we just, is nihilism just like a tendency in humans, like entropy, that is like a kind of entropy that maybe uh, democracy is just not as good at arresting as, say, some other form of social organization. So maybe it's not a problem with democracy itself, but there's just some sort of tendency in human beings to slide towards nihilism.
You see, that's why it's distinguished as liberal democracy, the specific kind of democracy built up by the Enlightenment. versus like democracy as such is simply having this kind of consent of the governed, like the the democracy of ancient Greece would not have disposed itself to this, especially because they had it be more restricted. Here we have a large emancipatory state where it's just everyone now gets to vote by virtue of basically just being there. And what do you do when you're saying that is now everyone opinions matter, whether even though we're obviously going to say some people's opinions are better than others, some people think better than others and are better at making decisions about certain things than others. But if everyone's just voting, then we can say, well, then the direction of the entire country and state, everyone just gets to have an equal say. So that's the little bit of the leveling effect. Uh, Here, no, Nietzsche's more concerned about the specifically Enlightenment liberal democracy.
Okay.
Where it's the kind of humanism that comes out of it as man being more of a measure of things. And this is also completely contingent and hanging upon Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God, which is the metaphysical structure that we were inhabiting for the longest time, but then slowly started to die away. And then like you get this really big turning point in the Enlightenment era where we have an almost switch. This is something that would be outlined in like Michel Alcin, forget his middle name, but it's just Michel Gillespie's book, The Theological Origins of Modernity, or try to think of the other one. I think John Milbank's tackles this as well in, what is it, Social Theory and Theology, I think is the title of the book, to show what that progress looks like of going from like the perennial philosophy from Plato to Aristotle all the way up to like Aquinas and I'm trying to think of the other ones. Can't do it off the top of my head, but sort of like that school, and then you have different revolutions that happen that get a big philosophical turn that kind of turns on the axis of metaphysics and epistemology. So that's what he's talking about there.
Okay. Maybe I'm being pedantic, but I just thought it would be helpful to sort of pick at this concept we're talking about, a liberal democracy, and sort of find the edges on it, I suppose.
Yeah, no, if you're with your like like your work on the construction site, and before you make a decision, you all hold a vote. Nihilism isn't going to emerge out of that. No, specifically talking about the presumptions and the premises underlying liberal democracy as we have it now as an inherent inheritance of the Enlightenment.
Right, and so maybe this would answer the second part of what I posed, and maybe this is something you want to put in your pocket for later. But do you think that Nietzsche would say, or maybe not even Nietzsche, just nihilists in general, or nihilist philosophers would say that nihilism in human beings is like a kind of entropic principle, and that human societies inevitably slide towards nihilism?
I have no idea if Nietzsche would say that or if anyone else would really say that as it's kind of an inherent quality. Where Nietzsche, I think, is a little bit more coming from is, I mean, by the end of it, he does say, no, this is all lies, because he's engaged in a hermeneutic of a suspicion. So he thinks like, no, the entire thing is kind of bankrupt.
Right.
So then he's like, basically not saying the death of God was an actual death of something real. He's more or less saying it was the death of an illusion. But what does that illusion leave in its wake when it collapses? That's what he's a little bit concerned with.
Okay.
So I think he's more to the other side. He actually, no, I remember in the book he does say like, no, people kind of need illusions to live. So then if those illusions start collapsing, as as a process of history, then what happens? How do we deal with that? Like, it's a bit of a confusion. And this happens with a lot of authors, to confuse what they talk about versus what they're actually giving as a prescriptive program. Where Nietzsche's not a philosophy of nihilism. His entire concern is with the diagnosis of it, and then figuring out what to do from there. Like, his actual prescriptive stuff is about the Ubermensch, the last man, creative destruction, the creation of new values in the wake of nihilism, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right, and that is an important distinction. Well,
But he does think, and this gets expanded upon a little bit later in the pages we have here, where you have the noble souls and then the rest of them. The rest of them are going to be really tough time and like the nihilistic era to come. because for them, they need someone to give them values. They need other people. But the noble souls, the Ubermensch, these are the ones who are going to create their own value. And that he's outlining something there. But for Nietzsche, no, I think he would be mostly saying that it's quite the opposite. People don't tend towards nihilism; they actually tend to try to avoid it, and will grasp at illusions to do so.
Okay. Yeah, there's a bunch of different other questions that I could ask, but instead of doing that, I think I will just let you press on so that eventually we can have Franzel weigh in on something because he's been sitting patiently for 20 minutes saying nothing.
Oh, no problem.
Literally just starts screaming at me. Let's see. So the next question can be very shortly summarized, where it's just what characterizes a nihilistic stories or shows about nothing, and it really kind of bottoms out with it's almost like you'd imagine a tragedy with no moral at the end of it. Like it's not like here's the character, everything goes wrong for him, but the story is pride before the fall. No, it's as if there's just nothing at the end of it. Uh, Here he's giving an example. Let's see, some basis for the audience might see. Yeah, so it has to give no means to get beyond that kind of nihilism. And he makes a distinction with like, let's look at Macbeth. Shakespeare's tragedy of Macbeth features the line spoken by the murderous Macbeth near the end of the play: "Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." But what we actually see in Macbeth is he actually falls, and he falls due to his own vices. So it's actually nihilism losing. It's that kind of pessimistic outlook being wrong at the end. So Macbeth itself isn't a nihilistic story. It has a nihilistic character or a theme to it, and you would also see it like in I'm absolutely sure in Dostoevsky, and even probably Tolstoy as well, if I'm remembering him
Yeah,
well enough.
I might even just point out in Macbeth that the triumphant characters at the end of that play, Macduff, what's Malcolm, um, all these characters sort of espouse a kind of divine right of kings ideology. So, which of course the play Macbeth is supposed to be sort of a homage to King James, and uh, um, sort of a well, yeah, just an homage to King James and his bloodline. But yeah, it's definitely the case in classic theater and most of classic literature that you do have these nihilistic characters that crop up from time to time, but almost always um, the point is that those people are an aberration. Um, Another good example from Shakespeare might be somebody like Iago, who in the more in Othello, Iago does all this um, really demented stuff, and you never really figure out why he does it. And so I think it's actually interesting that Shakespeare, who was sort of a playwright of the early modern era, starts to experiment with that character who you start to see more and more as literature progresses into the modern era, especially because someone like Iago is like prototypical of the modern villain, I guess. Um,
Mm, would you guys say that when it comes to, let's say, tragedy, that like what would distinguish for a nihilist story for like with like a story that isn't really nihilist at all? That the nihilistic story basically treats the bad thing happening or the tragic element as something that happens to the character rather than something that is caused by the character. So,
I'm
so that like in a non-nihilistic story, the agency of the character is far greater, even if it ends in tragedy and him ends in the character and having, a nihilist point of view.
It doesn't even really require that. What Hibbs is kind of outlining here is that all it needs is something that can be put to the contrary of it, some means out of it. Like it has to propose some sort of moral or social order uh, that what can go on can happen in distinction from. Like the only movie, because I'm so bereft of having watched movies. The only one movie I can think of that I would call nihilistic is a Scottish film called Filth. It's just like, imagine Bad Lieutenant, uh, if there were no redeeming qualities at all. It's just the downfall of a man with nothing. In fact, right at the end of the film, you see what might be the tiniest light for him to pull his way out of the hole he's dug himself. But then he misses the chance, and then he actually sort of looks at the camera, and his last words is just a kind of almost an absurdist laughing at the meaningless void, and then it just ends. There's just no way out. There's that versus something where you might have a version, something like Lolita, where you actually have the villain being the main character and you basically seeing everything through his eyes. But what you're seeing is it being distinguished from, like, you actually see him destroy this little girl's life, and then you actually are reading it very weirdly if you're seeing it as a romance and not a kind of exercise in how one might delude themselves. But that would be something, because there's a kind of distinction being pressed up against the kind of villainous character and the evil that's going on within the text. It can be just a kind of like underlying theme or something quietly as a meta narrative posed against it. So you have like the innocence of, the girl in Lolita versus the kind of self-deluded, self-serving wickedness of the main character.
Um,
If
sorry.
I may, actually, I could field Guru Savage's question in the
I just
comments
saw it.
down there. So Guru Savage asks, "Is there a distinction to be made between a story that is nihilistic and a story that is cynical?" I'll kick this over to Franzel, and maybe he can answer it better than I can. But I would say the distinction is that if a story is cynical, it implies that it's attacking something, some institution, or some uh, long-standing tradition, not necessarily because it is wrong or because it is evil or something like that. Or sorry, yeah, not because it's wrong or because it's a lie, but because it's hypocritical. Or it's not actually doing what it's purported to do. So, for example, a cynical movie about, um, you know, the a cynical movie, for example, about the Catholic Church. Might be a movie that paints the church in a sort of hypocritical light, whereas a nihilistic movie about the Catholic Church might be something like, for example, the Da Vinci Code, which I think is something that Hibbs brings up, where the Da Vinci Code is a kind of mythological story surrounding how the Catholic Church made up this mythology around Jesus. I think I remember that's what the Da Vinci Code being about.
Oh, no, I remember. No, that's actually in the preface down a few questions down. But actually, the very next question, Hibbs answers this a little bit, where he's saying he's using the words dark, forbidding, or stories without any hint of happiness. But what he's describing here is cynical stories. And what he says is that uh, as stories that can indict, yeah, no, like they're indicting something where it's a cynical disposition. So like you have a film that's a cynical indictment of the church, let's say, or morality or marriage, whatever have you. What he goes on to say is, but an indictment rests upon the supposition that the audience has access to standards by which it can find conventional society wanting. That immediately puts an end to nihilism. Because what he goes on to say is that it is not nihilistic unless it completely shuts that off. There is nothing. It's sound and fury ending in nothing. For it to be cynical, you're still proposing and presupposing some means of differentiating between higher and lower, base and virtuous, etc., etc., etc. So that's a bit of the distinction. So you can have something cynical as basically a kind of critique or a skepticism of something, but you're still presupposing some means of judgment, versus the nihilistic story that just says, nope, it's all nonsense.
So, an example of like a cynical story in that manner would be something like, let's say, Brave New World, which would that be a good example?
I could see that a little bit, because it would be a little bit cynical about, like, the population, the
Sure.
the demos, let's say,
Right.
where it's just like or it's just saying like society as whole as like if it's supposed to be a democratic body, but if they're all kind of lulled into a kind of slumber or stupidity, well, that's a kind of cynicism, but it's certainly not nihilistic.
To me, sort of the quintessential cynical piece of literature is Gulliver's Travels, because Swift has this kind of caustic, this sort of caustic wit, where he wants to, um, he tells these really, his satire is really biting, and he really takes on like a kind of misanthropic character in that book. But of course, the point of the book, the point of the book is that human beings are prideful and full of folly and ridiculous. But again, as Andrew was saying, the whole idea presupposes that people shouldn't be fools and shouldn't be prideful, and it's the thing about cynical literature like that. Again, just to beat a dead horse, is that it proposes a standard that the object is not meeting up to.
So the question after that is sort of a further upshot: is American culture nihilistic? And Hibbs basically answers this with no. In that America just really doesn't have a monoculture to analyze this from. In fact, it's got multiple overlapping subcultures, which is kind of painfully obvious. Where you have Southern culture, you have Northern culture, you have East Coast and West Coast. It's kind of obvious. Big country. There's an entire like history to go into kind of explain that. What are those different kind of cultures, like rural versus urban, yada yada yada. So that's kind of a well, it's an easy question. But then he goes on, he's saying that he's very surprised by just how quickly books, but TV shows and films disappear from the collective memory of the country. It's a cultural amnesia, which I really like, but that's for a separate project. And he uses as an example from 2004 Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. Like, box office hit. Wouldn't make any sense if the culture is actually nihilistic, because it would just be like a spectacle of nothing. But then you very quickly afterwards see, the Da Vinci Code at the same time being a best-selling book, which is a kind of, I wouldn't even say cynical, but it's sort of like proposing that, what the passion is based upon is just, it's just lies. It's just nonsense. So these two things are occurring at the same time. So we can't really concretely say, at least but through art or even literature, say that American culture is nihilistic, and that's what he's talking about here. And he says that, like in the weeks after Kill Bill replaces The Passion, so it's almost kind of schizophrenic. There's not this kind of like line of films where it's a very clear line. What we're basically going through here, and what Hibbs is addressing, is a certain underlying theme that is significant enough to be noticed, but it's not all-encompassing. Thing for that, or shall I just go?
So, what might be some examples? And I'm thinking we might turn to Franzel for this.
Oh, examples of what?
Of like nihilistic movies, art.
Yeah, well, okay. Aside from the ones he's gonna go and use.
Oh yeah,
Honestly,
we'll hit those first, and then let Franzel talk, I guess.
Trying to see here, because those are going to be talked about in the first pages. Like, I'll
Right.
just spoil it a little bit and go to like, he first starts talking about Woody Allen.
Yeah, he's gonna talk about Woody
in
Allen.
his films. Like, and he pulls from a quote from an interview where Woody Allen's basically describing himself in very nihilistic terms, and then you see that come through. And let's see, a very specific example would be, I think it's Tall Dark Stranger or Crimes and Misdemeanors, one of the two, where the story is basically a guy kills someone. It's like an inversion of Crime and Punishment, where it's, instead of like the moral consciousness of Raskolnikov eating him up, going like, no, I can't escape it, even though I wish I could, It's the opposite, where he realized, oh, I can live with this. This is fine. I don't care. It's meaningless. I killed someone, so what? That Hibbs is using.
I just wanted to point out for those who do go back and read this section of the book, it provides like a snippet from an interview that Woody Allen did, and I wasn't surprised at all to find out that Woody Allen is a r/atheism tier armchair philosopher.
He kind of got worse in that regard over the years. Like, if you kind of watch some interviews with him from like the time he made Manhattan, he already has a bit of that in him inside him, but like he's still like a bit more agnostic. Whereas when you read later interviews with him, he's just full on the kind of hardcore atheist nihilist train.
And there's always just the deep irony of it's the comedian who's the nihilist. It's getting into like the very first, like it's literally on the first pages of the book proper.
I mean, sure, I mean that kind of makes sense of like things that would normally be recognized as tragic or saddening. If you don't really have like an objective standard to measure those things, and they will seem comic to you, like to.
I don't want to spoil what I want to say once we actually start getting to that. Like it's literally the first pages. We're just about to get to it and talking about that. Just finished up the preface a little bit and we'll quickly return to all that.
Okay, go ahead.
The last two bits is: are there alternatives to nihilism in our culture? Hibbs answers this with yes, and he outlines some films that are kind of illustrating this. And his answer is basically a return to romanticism of a specific kind. In the film examples he gives to this is like E.T., Avatar, Forrest Gump, Dead Poets Society, Twilight, New Moon, and The Children of Men. And let me just quote him directly here about romanticism. Romanticism invites us to recover our innocence, to seek harmony with nature, and to live by a nobler code than that found in the calculative self-interest of modern economic systems. The problem with romanticism is that it locates human life in the midst of a series of conflicts whose resolution is far from clear. A reaction against the degrading and alienating effects of modern science and modern politics. Romanticism embodies a set of oppositions: innocence versus civilization, nature versus technology, child versus adult, feeling versus reason. Thus, romanticism itself can generate nihilism, which arises from the sense that we are hopelessly alienated. Are there stories that are simultaneously about nothing and something? That is, are there stories that wrestle with but do not succumb to nihilism? Yes, indeed. From The Ice Storm and The Secret Lives of Dentists to Christopher Nolan's Batman movies, film versions of J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter books, The Book of Eli, and Peter Jackson's film trilogy of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Popular American books and films address the sources of nihilism and provide imaginative visions that transcend or at least do not succumb to nihilism. That's what he's outlining. Here, I slightly diverge, slightly. But that's me. That's something that we'll get onto later.
Okay,
Do you want to
I'm interested to see how you diverge, but if you want to move on, we can go ahead.
May I ask a question about like those examples? Are those examples of stories? Because like the common thread between these stories seems to be that it's about like characters who are in a situation where they would be battling with like nihilism and some sort. Is like that the common thread that he is pointing towards, or is he pointing towards something different?
No, that's exactly what he's kind of pointing towards. I think he illustrates this in the book much later in the film The Dark Knight, where that's a literal combat where Joker and I'm already getting ahead of myself of one of my examples I want to use. Where in The Dark Knight, it's literally like, yeah, the two fairies, exactly that. Is here's an experiment, and it's kind of like an off play from like, okay, I'm just going to spoil what I'm going to talk about here. The Killing Joke, beautiful example of a character who's a true nihilist through and through. Everything anyone ever believed in has been a demonstrable gag. Why can't you see the funny side? But in The Dark Knight, he goes, here, I'm going to prove it to you. These two people are going to kill each other. They don't do it. Batman wins. It's the moral and social order reasserting itself contra nihilism. Harry Potter as well. You just have like Voldemort he's not that interesting of a character. He's just evil. Like, you have, like, okay, he was a dark child. Okay, so what? He's just kind of an evil guy. He's just like, I am darkness and sadness. Whatever.
I thought like the
And Harry
nihilism and
Potter then just kind of goes through the whole quest and just gets beaten up and then goes, I'm going to be courageous and brave, and then my friends, we're going to defeat you. So it's the
Except
same kind of thing.
except the cure for nihilism in Harry Potter is magical liberal bureaucracy.
Actually, I don't think so, because the liberal bureaucracy, I don't really want to talk about Harry Potter, but I push against that slightly. Who is it? The Trunchbull, whoever, they have like some lady from like the ministry department come in and start doing it, and everyone
Dolores
hates
Umbridge.
Mm.
I guess that is, and she's not being painted as a sympathetic character, nor is the Ministry of Magic. They're like, you're getting in the way of us actually fighting the evil. So for something, I don't know, I haven't looked at them in a long time, and I've not watched the movies very attentively.
The last time I read them was when I was like 16 years old. But like, I think like if there's a battle against nihilism within Harry Potter, it's mostly just how in the later books Harry's situation seems to be more hopeless as friends and loved ones die at the hands of his enemies.
And then you have Voldemort. Essentially, his whole plan is this kind of raw will to power. Like, he's the Superman. He's the Ubermensch, where he's just like, well, I'm powerful. Muggles aren't, so I get to rule stuff. I am the noble soul. And then it's this kind of, all of them come together in this little, what we can call this, like their little democratic defense forces. No, it's our unity that gives us power, and then that's what defeats. It's like,
I mean, by the end, love literally saves the day.
Yeah. Which is not wrong. we assert that as well, but
I do want to interject for just a second and say hello, Closington. I see him in the chat, and also I want to tell everybody who's watching this live. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's going to be Dave, Settler's Lament, Charlemagne, and I can't remember who else. Maybe that's all. They're going to be streaming an hour after this one ends, in about an hour and 20 minutes. So when you guys are done here, if you've got time, you might consider migrating on over there. That's just something that popped into my head.
So I think there's just two little questions left here, and it's just, does nihilism on screen produce nihilism in human souls? Does Hollywood lead or merely mimic the culture? Here he gives the complex answer of, kind of. It's the same thing where he's like, well, do video games cause violence, or do they just attract people who would like violence?
I think
So
he
that's kind of a boring
uses an
answer.
example of violent movies where he quotes Reservoir Dogs.
Yeah, if someone is watching that and going, I'm going to kill people, you're already screwed up.
Yeah, I did take umbrage a little bit with this little portion of the book, and maybe it's just because it's an older book, so it doesn't have the sort of up to date information that we have. But as far as I know, crime and violent crime and things like that are considerably lower in the United States.
No, they are, and in the pages we have, he does straight up say that. But then
Okay.
there's this fascination with violence. But we're also seeing, in some cases, just more extreme violence, just less frequently. Just in terms of raw numbers, not as many people dying. But we didn't have, what is it? I'm blanking on the name of the shooters. But like we didn't have like the Las Vegas shooter back in the 70s.
Right. Yeah, no, I know what you mean.
To be fair, this like fascination with violence may that just stem from the fact like that most stories, or pretty much all stories, are essentially about conflict, and like the way of externalizing conflict is to show violent conflict within a story.
What I like more is his little criticism of the response of Hollywood usually giving. I'll just quote him directly. Often when Hollywood is attacked for its corrosive effects on the culture, it responds by saying that it is simply reflecting what is out there in the culture already. But this is a dishonest answer, as there is nothing Hollywood prizes more than the idea that it is the source of social reform, or that it is the bastion of contemporary creative genius. At its best, Hollywood takes possibilities latent in our culture and makes them explicit by weaving them into a narrative and letting us see those possibilities lived out in human lives and communities. So I just like that a little bit, where it's just like if you watch the Oscars, it's nothing more than them saying, "We are the artistes. We are the creators of social reforms. Our movies make you consider the possibilities and yada yada yada." Then anytime anyone comes in saying, "Hey, you're doing X, Y, and Z, and you're pushing this kind of agenda or whatever," and they just go, "Oh no, we're art is merely reflective." So it's an have your cake, eat it too kind of thing, and it's just a little bit dishonest.
I've always thought of the Oscars as kind of like class superlatives.
It is. It's the most bourgeois thing I've ever seen, and this is coming from the bourgeoisie. I swirl wine and eat fancy cheeses. Like, what are you kidding? I'm just incredibly vulgar of my own volition. All right, so then the last little bit is, what is the point of watching shows about nothing? Can we learn from these? And this is incredibly short, so I'll just quote directly. There is little point to watching the most toxic shows, but other shows can illustrate the various sources of nihilism in our culture. Even when nihilistic shows instruct, they cannot, at least directly, do what art or even entertainment should do, which is to nourish the soul and inform the moral imagination. Now, shows that acknowledge the possibility of nihilism and display paths by which it might be overcome can indeed nourish the soul. And then that's his little ending there. And then the book starts proper. So now we can return to Woody Allen. So this is where Franzel can go. Can you illustrate a little bit of his little genealogy of nihilism for us?
Well, within the movies, it's kind of hard to see. Like, there's always been a bit of this nihilistic edge in Woody Allen's movies. Like, I think the most clear example to me is like in 1977's Annie Hall, where the movie basically starts with the kid version of Woody Allen's character Elvis Singer being depressed at the idea that the universe is expanding and that it will one day end. So immediately at the very beginning of the movie, it already sets this kind of tone of hopelessness to a certain extent. Although one,
That's early on, right?
yeah, that's actually pretty much early on in the career of Woody Allen. That being said, these are kind of like examples that, or this example particularly, like this is still like it is in the movie. It's pretty apparent, but it doesn't really take overhand. While later movies are a bit more extreme in that regard. Like the example we quoted a couple of moments ago, where it's basically about a murderer who just gets over the fact that he murdered someone.
Let me see.
Well,
I'll double check here. I'm pretty sure it's
Crime
either
crime
gonna
and
be
misdemeanors, I think.
crime and misdemeanors.
that or Tall Dark Stranger, but the book describes that like they're kind of playing on the same thing, but then one is just much more nihilistic.
Well, like something like Annie Hall or Manhattan. Those movies are mostly just kind of romantic comedies to a certain extent.
Then like the comedy is a little bit based on the absurdity. I'm assuming here
Yeah,
that it's
to a
kind of
certain extent.
it's someone exercising futile effort, so you're gaining a little bit of Schadenfreude from it. It's the humor of a kind of futile exercise.
Well, with Woody Allen movies, at least with the early ones, it's also like kind of that this kind of worldview is what is ingrained in like the more neurotic characters that Allen is playing, and he's mostly acting against less neurotic kind of characters, and like it's shown how like this attitude itself can kind of lead into like some trouble in life.
So I guess in that sense, it's almost like a Kierkegaard's anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, where he's playing this constantly anxious character because no direction in life. So it's essentially saying,
Yeah,
especially
that's fair.
if he's kind of almost playing himself in his own films, and from the quote that he's giving here, where he's just going like, "Yeah, there is no justice, there is no rational structure to it. That is just the way it is, and each person figures out some way to cope." You can kind of see how that would come off as an anxious person on film.
Yeah, every Woody Allen character is basically just stand-in for Woody Allen. Like it's especially like I'll like yet again bring up the examples of Annie Hall in Manhattan. In Annie Hall, he plays a comedian, which is like Woody Allen was a comedian for a time in his life. In Manhattan, he uh, plays someone who writes for TV shows, which is also something that Woody Allen used to do.
Mm.
So it's basically just a reflection of like his upper class life in New York.
Would you say that Woody Allen's characters have a kind of like jester like quality?
Mm,
Because
not really.
I have no experience with I I have more experience with Shakespeare than Woody Allen, which is why I asked the question.
I'm not really sure about that.
Because it seems like, just going off of your description, because again I'm not familiar with Woody Allen, it seems like the dynamic is that you've got these characters who think that life means something or think that something is important, and then the sort of perspective character is kind of laughing at their folly of sort of thinking that anything
Oh,
they do matters.
no, not really. Like, there's some
No.
instances in which they may kind of look down upon that sort of perspective, but it's mostly just how they interact with these characters and how they, since they kind of have like this different view, kind of set up their own life for failure. But like, especially in these romantic relationships, which are depicted in Woody Allen movies.
Okay.
Hibbs points that out, that you have a lot of underlying recurrences in the Woody Allen themes. Like partially, it's like relationships never work.
Yeah,
Is a kind, and
basically.
that's being a kind of nihilism. It's like that's a futile effort. It's just nonsense. Relationships are a fantasy.
Which
Uh,
is interesting because when you look at like the relationship within Woody Allen movies, they kind of fail because of like the kind of character Woody Allen is in these movies.
it's
I don't know if he's
a
conscious of that.
cinematic Freudian slip.
Like in early interviews, like again, I mean, I think it's on YouTube, the interview where he that was taken during the time when Manhattan came out in 1980, I think. Like that pretty much has Woody Allen stating, yeah, it's kind of like these relationships end up being horrible, but they kind of end up being horrible partially because of the main character's kind of behavior. But then again, this was Woody Allen still being a bit more self-aware and like less completely nihilistic.
I want to move on to the next little bit here that Hibbs kind of points out. Within this little excerpt from the interview, he's talking about his buddy, I think, Billy Graham. I'm not sure if they're quite friends, but he's referencing Billy Graham in a conversation he had where Billy Graham told to him, like, look, even at the end of my life and I find out God doesn't exist, I would have lived a better life than you. And, like, Woody Allen actually agrees with that. It's like, no, he's actually right. But then he goes on to, like, this deriding thing is like, look, yeah, if you can delude yourself by believing that some Santa Claus is going to bail you out in the end, yeah, sure. Hibson goes and is like, yeah, this is amateur philosophy. This is actually just garbage. It's nonsense here. But in Woody Allen's viewing of this, what he is describing is the kind of Nietzschean, the same thing that we referred to earlier, where most people need illusions. Most people can't really deal with the fact that there's just nothing there, so they need their illusions. But here, Woody Allen is a little bit of a hypocrite because he's actually using his art as a kind of uh, panacea, or like to assuage that kind of anxiety here. But then what Hibbs actually points out here is that when the film insists on telling you directly and repeatedly that life is pointless, that illusion is necessary, and illusions are to be valued insofar as they suit you, then the illusion is unmasked. It no longer works as an illusion. The problem with the therapeutic bluntness is that whatever works does not work. So he's sort of shooting himself in the foot, and you can almost now see a kind of, maybe on like some subconscious level, Woody Allen realizes that, and that's why the nihilism in his film starts becoming more and more explicit. Where before he's just kind of going, yeah, I don't think anything is real, and now he's just kind of finding himself. It's a kind of a like a law of diminishing returns. Every movie doesn't seem to distract him enough anymore. So then he just becomes more and more pessimistic. So then he just cranks out stuff that is just absolutely nihilistic there onward. Okay, let's see the next. See if we can find the next thing to talk about here. Okay, a few other instances of where we kind of find some themes in our movies that illustrate a kind of nihilistic, or here at least specifically a hermeneutic of suspicion. Where we have in the popular song by the Goo Goo Dolls, when everything feels like the movies, you bleed just to know you're alive. And I like that, again, for a totally different project. But then we have like the Matrix and Inception, where we're inhabiting some sort of illusion, and the idea is to get to the real. And there's always a kind of fear of what the real is. And then he actually starts going on to talk about. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, like Inception, I can kind of see where like the nihilist angle can come in, and I think the author references that, like with the ending shot of the movie, where it's not clear if the main character has finally broken out of the illusion of he's still in there, and it's kind of implied that it perhaps doesn't even matter all that much.
But then here, especially if we kind of compare that to what we just said about illusions, is almost a kind of nihilism. It's just sort of, I give up on trying to figure out what the truth is to get back to the real. This illusion makes me happy, I'm going to stay here. So it's actually just this kind of, take the blue pill, just stay in the Matrix, because the real is too difficult to deal with, because the real is, too far out of our reach. We can't reach it, or it doesn't exist at all. So you can make an argument that at the end it does give a kind of expression of it.
Yeah, I don't know if that even works. I think that sort of betrays the kind of problem um, like Hibbs relates to in terms of Woody Allen's analysis of Billy Graham, and I would say also one of the shortcomings of something like how Pascal's wager is typically thrown around. It's this idea that you can um, like believe something propositionally, like place a bet on a belief, or willfully delude oneself. Um, I think this all kind of ties into the vagueness of the way that humans come to believe in things, and how it's kind of impossible to uh, trick yourself. And I think that's also something that you got to as you're talking about how Woody Allen's movies, as they go on, they get more nihilistic because, as you said, there's this kind of law of diminishing returns.
Well, I think like the examples that were listed now is like nihilism taking a bit of a different shape, where there might be like a real and an unreal kind of world, but like the distinction ultimately doesn't really matter, at least for the main character involved. So there is like no higher ideal or lower ideal at the end, at least again from the character's perspective.
Right.
Another movie that kind of comes to mind in that vein, and that's somewhat surprising since it's a Martin Scorsese movie, a man who is at least, I'm not sure if he's still a Catholic, and I think he's a lapsed Catholic, but have you guys seen Shutter Island?
No.
It's essentially, it's kind of a bit of an homage to like kind of like 1950s kind of crime movies and suspense thrillers. Like it's about um, two I think detectives investigating a case at an insane asylum, and like as time goes by, it turns out that all of this has been a bit of an illusion, and that Leonardo DiCaprio's character is actually just an inmate of the insane asylum who is working through issues.
Oh, I
And
see. It's the old classic. You watched this whole movie and actually it was a hallucination by a crazy person.
sure, but by the end, it's even a bit more extreme, where it seems like Leonardo DiCaprio has finally accepted the truth. Like, for most of the movie, he thinks that there's a conspiracy in this asylum against him, where they're doing illegal experiments and kind of turning people crazy for government purposes. When it actually comes out that he was just an inmate, as to his therapist, what would you prefer? To live like a monster or to die as a good man? Implying that he doesn't really.
Red pill, blue pill, doesn't matter. They're both, it's irrelevant which one you take. Whichever one you accept as the real becomes the real for you. And
Yes,
so you take the one that you'd prefer.
yeah, pretty much.
All
Let me see
right.
here. Oh, I just lost it because people were knocking at my door, so I'm probably going to step away again for a minute or two at some point here. Oh, no, I need to go a page back. That's where it was.
All
So
right.
let's see here.
It
Oh, okay,
says
hit is going on.
if you'll
Yeah,
get
what?
if you'll give me 1 second. It does say the stream is doing poorly, and I have no idea why. I'm looking at OBS and there's like, 0.3% dropped frames, so I'm not exactly sure what the problem with that is. You guys in the chat, could you tell me how the stream is doing? Oh, I think we may be back. I think we just had a little lag spike. But continue on, Andrew.
Yeah, I'm actually going to skip over the other thing because it's actually a little bit. It's just talking about the banality of nihilism, which he actually starts tackling in the later parts of the book. Macbeth, where it's just like, well, the character of Macbeth is in some, he's not proposing some grand narrative to combat against. In fact, like at the end of the book, he loses and the moral and political order reasserts itself. So he's actually more of an aberration. So again, back to uh, to quote directly, nihilism is the vantage point of the morally depraved, not the normative judgment of the artist. And then I'll just quote the little paragraph here. If art no longer communes with the good, the true, and the beautiful, and if it feels duty bound, when such an obligation in a nihilistic world could even come from, to inform us that its magic is merely illusory, then it loses its capacity to enchant or even pleasantly distract. It loses its claim on us, citing great works of the past whose very assumptions the new art has dismissed as so much infantile, wishful thinking cannot improve matters. So here we come to Hibbs' little shot at nihilistic works of art.
See, it seems like taking another step at Woody Allen, who like in his movie frequently cites like various pieces of high culture.
Yeah, he goes back a page before and starts talking about it. And I think one of his films he quotes right from Macbeth. At one point, I think down here a little bit. I can't see which movie it is, but the characters, Ramirez, taunted citizen. No, that's later. Where is it? Shoot, I lost it. It's somewhere in this where Hibbs talks about a Woody Allen character is like rehearsing lines in front of a mirror of like answering the meaning of life, and he gives like a Nietzschean quote for it. But then he even dismisses that as being kind of nonsense and frivolous, to where even his own nihilism just bears no weight. It's just empty. It's banal. Then Hibbs wants to go a little bit outside of talking about films and goes back to talking about uh, Mitchell Heisman in a suicide on the steps of the Memorial Church in Harvard Yard, where he left not so much a manifesto. It's still more of a suicide note, as far as I can tell here. But it's about almost 2,000 pages, including 1,400 footnotes and a 20-page bibliography, with 1,700 references to God and 200 references to Nietzsche, of all things. But in what we get in a quote from there is actually no, not a quote. I think this is actually from one of the articles written on the event is every word, every thought. No, this is a quote. I think every word, every thought, and every emotion come back to one core problem: life is meaningless. The experiment in nihilism is to seek out and expose every illusion and every myth, wherever it may lead, no matter what, even if it kills you. Uh, this is where Hibbs is wanting to talk about, like, it's one thing to just have these kind of frivolous nihilistic exercises on film, but when it actually manifests itself in day-to-day life, we understand it's actually aren't living in illusions. They need truth, and the truth actually just isn't in fact nihilistic. Now we start going into where he's talking about like serial killers, where like Ramirez, I think Ramirez was the dating show killer, and he like when being brought into court started shouting, "I'm beyond you, I'm beyond good and evil," a straight up Nietzschean quote. Da, 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 da. Let's see, natural born killers. I know he brings up a certain citation here. Not sure I lost it. I think it probably might be on a page further along. Or it might have been in the Woody Allen movie or something, I'm not sure. But anyways, going back to here.
Well,
Let's see.
what's the through line here? Like, what's the sound bite of what we're looking at right now?
Right now, kind of just illustrating a little bit of what nihilism is and kind of certain examples to it. So before we start getting down to a quiddity of it, we're grabbing things that are familiar. That's why we start off with films and start off with like Woody Allen's quote, because it's a clearer example. And then he goes on further on down where it's like we get like the suicide note, where its fundamental question is like it's the Albert Camus question is like the only real question of philosophy is the question of suicide. Is life worth living? Which is again this kind of the funnel of nihilism. So here we're just moving away slowly because then the next section he starts talking about Nietzsche himself, what he's talking about, and starting to get down to the bottom of it. So I'm just quickly running over this stuff to give a little bit of commentary on it.
Right.
Let's see. Hibbs starts talking about Michael Medved in his book Hollywood versus America, Popular Culture and the War on Traditional Values, where this is talking a little bit of a certain corrosive effect. And this goes back because Hibbs is essentially Platonic, as I understand him, towards art, where it's asking what's the purpose of art. Art has a purpose sort of in and of itself insofar as it's like it's true, good, and beautiful. Like sometimes a painting is just good because it's good. It's just a good painting, and that's fine. That's an end in and of itself. But things like plays and just even paintings themselves have some responsibility for the formation of the moral imagination. The easiest and most accessible example of this are like children's fairy tales, like Grimm's fairy tales, where there's some moral to the story. It's a very fantastic and illustrative version that's easily graspable by people for them to understand some sort of moral question, which is why Christ did not come giving us treatises, he came telling us parables, because it's the easiest thing to understand, and it helps form the moral imagination. So here, if we have our moral imagination being formed by popular culture, which in like the let's say the paragraph before, it's still Michael Medved. His Zealotin critique is we have no other culture than popular culture, and popular culture is Hollywood, especially television. So then we have this problem where part of our formation is created by this, in that popular culture is sort of inescapable. And this is we're talking a little bit about sort of a question of technology, but that's an entirely different discussion. Then we have ourselves a little bit of a problem here.
Okay. So we've got this through line of nihilism in culture from things like these Woody Allen movies, but we can also trace it through real things that are going on in society, like the Heisman suicide. Is that his name, Heisman?
Yeah, Mitchell Heisman.
The Heisman suicide, or these serial killers who have this nihilistic outlook. Um, and so, my sort of question, maybe, maybe this is a topic for a different stream or a topic for later in the stream. But are we going to address maybe like uh, why does this nihilistic culture or this nihilistic art have an effect on people like on Heisman or on these serial killers? Like what's the connection here? How does it jump from the world of film and art to real life? And then how do we get back to this kind of Platonic view of art that Hibbs seems to have? This idea that art is supposed to mor- reinforce moral values or something like that. Like how are we planning on bridging that gap?
Uh, he actually does start to go off here, uh, just down the page to the later paragraph where he says, "Those of us who are being critical of Hollywood would do well to ponder the following questions: Why does our democratic culture breed such demonic characters, and why should American citizens be so captivated by these figures of rebellion, both in real life and in fictional accounts?" So this is where we're. Yeah, you're doing very well to help me lead into the the next bits actually.
Right.
So, but he answers uh, the question lies like the relationship between the art culture versus the culture itself as not being like a direct kind of cause and effect. Is there sort of
Hmm.
more uh, what is it, correlational,
Well,
pushing and pulling on each other?
I think I've heard you describe it as a kind of miasma.
Yeah, if everything around you is kind of speaking to that on some level, uh, that's kind of your manner of thinking. It's sort of like you would have no ability to. Uh, I don't know. That wouldn't work as a very good example. Uh, if you're not exposed to it, you just don't have the psychological material to think about it. It's sort of like if you don't know any other way of life, why would you start, genuinely trying to imagine or have some sort of dialectic with something else? Like if you always have only ever lived in North Korea and you have little exposure to anything outside of that, then you don't start imagining democratic societies. You just don't. So if you're in a culture that constantly presents you with just the images or like the fantasies and fiction that has this undercurrent of nihilism, you start losing the ability to even talk about anything outside of that. It just becomes, as I said, the miasma. It's the air you breathe. So
Hmm.
then it just kind of starts producing that, but it's this push and pull where the people making these films are produced by the culture, but then they also produce the artifacts of that culture that then bear some influence on it. So it's a bit of this kind of push and pull, a back and forth for a kind of system.
And I might also add, uh, something you said about Nietzsche and his approach, and which I do think I don't think he says this word for word later on in this section, but when we were discussing this earlier, you were talking about Nietzsche's sort of hermeneutic of suspicion and how this falls back into nihilism. And it just seems to me like the hermeneutic of suspicion is, it's the easiest way for people to feel smart. So in a society like our own, where well, any society, people want to feel smart. I mean, that's kind of a it's not a very interesting observation, but the idea that we have this technology now, or this way of looking at the world that is just to question everything and never accept any reply, any sort of rebuttal as
It's literally the postmodern condition, and
right.
this is what I'm building up to: is that we find in the postmodern theorists is that they're just a footnote to Nietzsche. That's it.
And it just seems to me like that's such an easy track or an easy mindset to get into. It requires zero effort or like zero mental effort. Um, and it seems like there's no way to sort of penetrate it, I guess.
So here's a little bit of kind of the series of events here is you have Nietzsche kind of observing the society he's in and going, uh-oh, we've killed God. We've blasted out the metaphysical substructure that we need to hold everything up. All of it, the whole shebang, not just religion, but Enlightenment science, our political theory, everything. The whole thing is based upon the metaphysical substructures. We're blasting that out. And it's going to collapse down and people are going to realize it one day. So then he's panicking, going, okay, well, what do you do about that? But we kind of inhabit that corpse a little bit here. We just don't have that kind of understanding or language. Speak about that. It's sort of like Alexander McIntyre's in the first pages of his After Virtue, where he's describing a kind of like, imagine apocalypse happens and we have to cobble together science from the stuff, like basically artifacts essentially. It's like that's what we're kind of inhabiting right now, is we're kind of left with these little bits and pieces that kind of hold things together. And that's entirely what the postmodern theorists were trying to deal with, is, okay, here we are now. How the hell do we understand anything? How do we engage with anything? This is where we get the problem of interpretations, the problem of history, and this, or like with Baudrillard's simulacra and simulation, is if we're never able to now touch out with the real, we're just engaged with images. We're just making references to images of images of images. It's entirely simulated. It's in a simulated existence. It's fantasy. Kind of the little bit of the progression that we see here.
Okay.
I lost myself in my own thought, which is why I think people sometimes
No,
pull me back down.
that's fine. Do you wanna come back? I'm gonna reel you back down to earth for a second, and let's go ahead and finish out the section of Hibbs that we have left.
Yeah. There's just in one more section of it, and I can start blowing through it a little bit, because we kind of already went over this a little bit.
Right.
So here Hibbs begins talking about. Now he's starting to get into like talking about Nietzsche as himself. He's building up to it. He's like, well, then where does this nihilism come from? And Nietzsche starts talking about it. Let's see. What do we want to talk about here? Yeah, he starts saying Nietzsche is the philosopher of the era to both laymen and scholars. You just know he's the guy. He's the diagnosis. He starts talking about like Francis Fukuyama caused a stir when he suggested in The End of History and The Last Man that the nearly worldwide acceptance of democracy means we are now living in a post-revolutionary age, that humanity has no great battles left to fight, and hence that we have reached the end of history. Absent some clear defined enemy or profound challenge, there is a danger that the tensions and springs of human greatness will dissipate, that human beings will become what Nietzsche called the last man, who have a calm indifference to all elevated aspirations. Writing as a social critic influenced more by de Tocqueville than by Nietzsche, Andrew de Blanco traces three great moments in the American manner of constructing the purpose of our lives together. The first, the Puritan movement, was organized around the Christian God. The second, which comes to fruition in Lincoln, focused on the sacred nation itself. And the third, our current era, a period of liberation from all external standards, bestows the highest value on the self. Our era is an era of irony, of detachment from deep and lasting convictions. This is a very pretty way of saying we're postmodern now. This is what he's kind of describing, is that it's a very slow kind of pathology. We blasted this stuff out back in the Enlightenment era, and we're just now, and there's the door. I'm going to have to step up, and I'm going to quickly finish this up here. We're now just inhabiting that corpse. We're only now really experiencing some of the upshots, where we are in a complete poverty of language and poverty of thought to be able to describe good and wrong, higher and lower, or anything that can really uphold any justified, anything that's lasting conviction. Everything is handled with a sense of irony. We're now getting into the meta-modern condition, which is more of the response to the postmodern. And I'll have to step out for a little bit. Talk amongst yourselves.
Okay. All right. So Andrew has stepped away, which means we have lost our intellectual heavy artillery, so to speak, because I'm just the guy that runs the stream. Franzel, did you want to talk? You've been very patient and very quiet.
No, mostly I was just listening to Andrew.
Okay. Well, one of the things you might say, or we might explore, for a couple of minutes, and then maybe I'll start taking questions from the chat. Is we've talked about a few good examples of this nihilistic strain in film, but can maybe you can talk about Hibbs gives the example of like the Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and these sorts of fantastical stories that are meant to be over and against the nihilistic impulse. Can you think of some other examples, maybe that maybe are less well known, or maybe that's not what we think of when we think of sort of anti-nihilistic art or literature?
Honestly, I think like most kind of escapist genre fiction is like very much anti-nihilist, since it's very much dependent and contingent on like romantic notions of good and evil. So pretty much everything that covers that, like from like the most obvious examples, like Star Wars, at least like the original movies.
Right.
Pretty much everything that kind of involves um, heroes in the story as like a conception of the good.
Okay. Can you think of any examples maybe that like aren't fantasy? Because you might somebody who's more skeptical, and this is what I've been trying to think of as Andrew's sitting here and talking. I'm thinking, okay, but like, what if I'm this kind of skeptical person? I just don't believe in these things, and I haven't been convinced that there is such a thing as good and evil, right and wrong, and all these things, you know, and then when I, as this kind of moral skeptic, look out on the artistic landscape and I see that the only kinds of stories that give a compelling um, narrative about morality are fantasy. The Middle Earth does not exist. Harry Potter doesn't exist. The Star Wars, none of it exists. It's all made. It has no basis in reality, or at least
Honestly,
that's what someone might say.
this might be a bit of a strange example, but Dave the Distributors brought us up once in a video. Pulp Fiction is honestly a movie that kind of gets towards the notion of the moral good.
Yeah,
Um,
I remember seeing that video actually, and yes, I agree. Um, Although it's been a long time since I've seen Pulp Fiction, but you're right. There is this current in Pulp Fiction that does seem like it's sort of, well, I mean, Dave the Distributist in his analysis sort of treats it um, as sort of the in the
movie about the
film.
four loves, basically.
Yeah, right. You're working your way through the four loves up to from the lower to the higher loves. So yeah, something like Pulp Fiction is a good example. Although I don't know that that's the takeaway that most people get from Pulp Fiction.
Hibbs uses Pulp Fiction. Does that, like, what is it? I've never watched the movie. Mea culpa, you know, put me on the stake. I know, but like I think I remember it's exactly in this book where Hibbs talks about like the way out of this crazy situation. I forget which character, but he gets on a helicopter literally called Grace. The
Oh
escape is
yeah,
God.
like
I think it might be in the later chapter called God Intervenes.
like one of the characters who gets out alive out of the story, at least when it comes to killers who kind of work for this gangster, um, is the one who thinks that the fact that he basically almost literally dodged the bullet is due to divine intervention, and he decides to change his
The,
life
yeah, the divine
drastically.
actually reasserts itself in this sort
Yes.
of funny and humorous manner, but then it's still there. The escape from the crazy story is God. So it's like it's there. It's just a little bit funny.
But then my question is, do you almost need in this artwork that's not fantastical but still provides a non-nihilistic framework of the universe? Do you need this kind of Deus ex machina, God intervenes in the story um, in order to give it a kind of purpose, a kind of sort of telos to the narrative? Is that necessary?
Uh,
I mean, if you kind of restructure Pulp Fiction into like, or at least like view the different episodes in like a more traditional narrative structure, then like this could almost be viewed as a kind of inciting incident, like something that drastically changes the course of the characters taken. So something like that's, or in a sense, always needed. So I'm not entirely sure if it has to be something like a Deus Ex Machina, but there has to be like something that drastically shifts the character's perspective from like a more cynical and perhaps nihilistic view to something that suggests meaning.
like what's kind of happening there is I would actually place it in a category of meta modern, because what you have there is the kind of cynicism and skepticism of the postmodern. But then what you do is this reemergence of sincerity, the new romantic, where it is the enchantment reasserts itself in this kind of depraved world, and that's actually the out. But it's still completely encapsulated in this totally, cynical affair. So it's as metamodernism is sort of described as it being a kind of pendulum sweeping back to the pre-modern romanticism to the postmodern skepticism. So it's this oscillation between the two, but it's actually very optimistic as well. Where it's just here's this crazy, crazy violent story, but then enchantment reasserts itself, and it's the way out.
Well, the only question I have about that is, we've talked about how we've got the nihilism in art and cinema, and how there's a bleed back and forth in something like the suicide of Heisman or these serial killers. Um, but I don't think we have a similar kind of thing going on with like. First of all, I can't think of I can't think of any movies that represent a kind of new sincerity other than maybe Pulp Fiction, the way that we're breaking it down and analyzing it. And I certainly don't see that emerging as a very prominent component of culture. To me, I'm a little bit, and this is a bit ironic, I think, but I'm a little bit skeptical of the idea that just sort of asserting that, because it seems to me like, you know, I- am just playing devil's advocate here, maybe, but it seems to me like there's all this asserting that actually there is purpose and good and beauty, and to me a lot of it looks like just assertions. Like where's the hard foundation to all this? I guess I would say, and where's the hard foundation that would be compelling to someone who is caught up in this kind of uh, skeptical or this hermeneutic of suspicion, as we've said.
To that, my response is we're 8 pages in the book. It's not the entire thing hasn't been outlined yet, and then also, well, you can burn through the nihilism, but eventually you can just go back to basics and just you know, you know go back to where the very cartoonish version of like, well, we were on a line here with like the perennial philosophy, and then we had a little divergence somewhere, and that project has fallen apart. So then we just get back on track.
Right.
So it's a manner of trying to draw us back in some way, which is an entirely different project and an entirely other conversation. Here, I really want to restrict ourselves to the text as much as possible to see what Hibbs is saying, and then try to just generate some sort of psychological material for thinking,
Okay,
basically.
that's fine. I like to try to give people some amount of closure within the
Yeah,
stream.
no, it's a good question, but the reason for picking the book is because it's talking about something complex and difficult but pertinent, but isn't just laden down in theory. Because I could go to my bookshelf and get you something laden in theory. People want to yap about culture, and it's really easy to get in talking about theory through culture. So that's why it's the starting book to get people thinking a little bit. Then you can transfer to just like the dry theory at some point.
Well, I can't argue with that. I think what we might do for the next 30 minutes is just field questions from the audience, and then I think we can close out. Does that sound like a good idea?
We got one last section here that I can kind of blow through.
Oh, okay. I thought we were done.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
No, that was the end of like the very first section of the book. The next one is Nietzsche and democratic nihilism, and I can sum this up pretty quickly. It's where Nietzsche's gripes with democracy is that it's a leveling effect where actual struggle is kind of repressed a little bit, so you don't have what he's talking about here as the this which he's picking up from Plato, spiritedness or the noble soul. When there's nothing to strive against, it's just sort of a kind of repressment in a sort of way. Like greatness goes unnoticed. Let's see what's here. Let's see. Now I'll start off with the first bit that he's talking about here, where he's Zarathustra, from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. There's a bit in here that actually very, very well describes the postmodern democratic man. Alas, the time of the earth has become small and always finds it in his best interest to go with the flow, to conform to the dictates of common opinion. Yet he does not regard this conformity with passivity or as slavish, because there is no one person to whom he submits. In following the majority, he does but follow his own will. Zarathustra expiates. No shepherd in one herd. Everybody wants the same, everybody is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily into the madhouse. One has one's little pleasure for the day and one's little pleasure for the night, but one has a regard for his health. When Zarathustra speaks these words to ordinary citizens, instead of being insulted by his images of their shallow and petty souls, they clamor, "Turn us into these last men." So here, this is where he's illustrating his issue with democracy. It's this kind of, it's literally the democratization of value, the democratization of almost merit to a certain extent. And then what you get is a little bit of an upshot from that is this kind of willingness enslavement to it. Here, I'll cite someone that people are going to be a bit more familiar with. Where Chesterton, I can't remember the exact place or quote for it, but where he's talking about freedom of thought is a little bit pernicious because what it starts to entail a little bit is it almost lies to you to a certain extent. I think if I can reiterate it, I just read this. Shoot, I can't. Blanking on a little bit.
I think it's
Where
more
he's
an
talking about,
orthodoxy,
like,
right?
It could be, but I'm not sure. You know what I'm talking about? Where I think the bit, because it's somewhere filed away in my head in sort of an amalgam of certain things, where it's a kind of here I'm actually quoting Zizek saying that like we're so free that we don't actually have the language to describe our unfreedom. To where now I'm just a voluntary slave because I think no, I'm freely choosing this, freely thinking, but you're only freely think correctly. It's like, yet you're freely thinking when you freely think your way to democratic liberalism.
Sure, basically where like free thought subscribes a kind of right thought. And like I think Chesterton kind of made an example of that in orthodoxy, if correctly.
So here, this is kind of what Zarathustra is saying, that like there is, what is it? Yeah, there's no shepherd in one herd. There's no sovereign where you say, okay, that's where the authority is. It's sort of like, here I'm pulling a little bit, like from Foucault as well, talking about societies of discipline. It's very easy if you're just enslaved, comes over me, captures me, puts chains on me, and then makes me a slave. I can point to and physically see where the authority is and where the oppression is. Now it dissipates. I don't know anymore because it's now just been democratized. The authority is no longer just in a head and a sovereign. It doesn't come from the seat of the sovereign. It's now the will of the governed. So whence does it come? Who steps on me? It's hard to tell anymore, especially now because at least before, when you get to like an industrialized democratic society, you can at least point to like your foreman and your boss and say like, okay, this guy is, like let's say what's the period, the Gilded Era, where we had just utterly horrible work conditions where if you wanted to eat, you're basically going to have to go to the factory for like 40 hours. And you can point to, okay, the foreman, there you go. That's the guy. He's the one who's oppressing me. Even that's now just been dissipated with like different levels of middle management. It starts to disappear a little bit. So we're now, there's no shepherd but one herd. It's just an amalgam. And now anyone who questions that or wants to step outside of it is going to either do two things: is going to be mad and on the outskirts of society, they become fringe, or they willingly put themselves into the madhouse. And here what we might be talking about is the very like that. It doesn't get to the core of it. It tries to wash over the symptoms. You come in, you're depressed, you have anxieties about it. Okay, here's a pill. It'll just cover it up. Go back to work. It's all just dissipated. But here, it's the last little bit. Instead of the people saying, this is terrible, we need to fix this, no, make me this. It's, I think it's Anthony Snyder, I can't remember exactly, but it's servant volontaire. It is I become a willing practice of enslavement, and there's one person who's going to love me for saying this. It's especially when Foucault wants to talk about the panopticon, or there's no longer the visible. Yeah, no, you know exactly. It's just giddy as a schoolgirl me saying this. No, it's the internalization of your own oppression. Where now it's because I am so free, I have freely, willingly engaged in my own enslavement. To where now, in the process of me engaging with the society on this level, I have to internalize like the panopticon. There is no like I can see the structure where it's like I in America I can say it's the White House or something. That's a structure of authority. It's the building of the judge, like the courthouse or the police department or something. There's the building, but there is no person. There isn't like some stable seat of authority. It's all been democratized and kind of gone like underground or something. It's deterritorialized, if I'm going to be pretentious. So then what happens now is what's guiding me is the internalized panopticon, is because I'm simply a part of the herd. It's like a herd mentality that I willingly submitted to. So here's where I like to be a little bit provocative, is what happens when you pick up the phone, like the iPhone. It's like on the surface level, what does it sell you as? It's, oh, there's so much freedom involved into it. You have access to the internet, so many movies and books and music and all this stuff, and you can stay connected with your friends. It's this freedom. It's this liberating item. It's, you know, it's a fetishist object. To be vulgar about it. But what's underneath it? What happens to that? Yeah, I can use Facebook and Twitter, but what happens from that is the selling of my very information, the data, to both government and corporations. I am now willingly enslaved to it. Because then what do we get? We get cancel culture as a very kind of obscene version of this. I got distracted by chat for a second. I'm recognizing someone in there. But like, because when I sell my data to them, they now control me to a certain extent, where they can now constantly, like, you know, the old adage, the internet never forgets, data doesn't forget. So if I'm constantly engaging with this, I'm selling it now to this very vague system of authority. This vague system, it's no longer a society of discipline, it's a society of control that I willingly engage with, that I willingly walk into. This is where we get back to is I am so free, I do not have the language to describe my unfreedom. For as you say what everyone else says, it's this weird perversity that we have here underlying it, but is holding up the entire thing. It's like a willingly taken, you know, hallucinogenic. It's just where I wanted to go with that thing. This book doesn't talk about it at all, but I'm trying to build up something. This is a separate project I want to deal with. But Nietzsche is actually sort of heralding this. What I just talked about is you seeing come up in Foucault and Baudrillard. And that's because they're footnotes to Nietzsche. These are things that come up as an upshot of what Nietzsche's talking about. Like, that's what the entire postmodern theorists were trying to deal with is, we have this set of problems. They don't have a program. They just have a set of problems. And they just don't know how to deal with them all.
I'm just sitting here, Andrew, and I'm thinking, what's the correct way to hook him to draw him back?
Just it's like, Andrew, please, you'd be crazy and eclectic.
but
Like,
but
settle
but
down.
but no, this is a good point, and I think this will end up being fodder for subsequent discussions. Is
This is part of a much bigger project I'm working on.
Well, it's kind of to bring it back to the Canis Society, to the people who we represent on this stream. This is kind of the project of the Canis Society in a way, is to give people the kind of tools the to understand the machine that they've put themselves in, and understand maybe ways ways out of this sort of willing self-slavery.
Or is like, there's a little joke, at least on the server when I was trying to explain this with visualistic language, is saying my whole project is that we're in a box, and then that there's this latex screen around us, and all we can really do is push and prod and stretch it, and the screen is reflexive. It's it's responsive to your attacks and absorbs them and restructures itself with it. So the entire point is to keep poking and prodding until your finger gets through just a little bit, and you can start tearing your way out of the box. Then we can start looking back and going, okay, now what? That's a little bit is developing that language, that diagnosis, and that lexicon that we can actually engage with describing the actual unfreedom and then a way through and out of it. But that's an entirely different
And
topic.
I think that's probably a good place to stop. um,
I was gonna get in talking about the little bit of the comments where I get to say jouissance again.
oh, okay.
The last little bit here, where in the book he starts describing here a separation of eros, where it is not as it was traditionally understood. Eros is sort of not simply a sexual drive. It was more about like a movement towards beauty and wholeness. But then what happens when you have this just basically a kind of a sexual drive tied up with a kind of nihilism? Let's see, I can just kind of quote here is like
Wasn't the mere sexual drive about Venus? Sorry.
I don't know, is that Freud or Lacan?
Okay.
I didn't do Freudian psychoanalysis. That's we skip over him incredibly quickly. Let's see. Distorts this part is still classically understood. Eros is not reducible to the desire for bodily pleasure, even less to the gratification of the sexual appetite, but encompasses these desires with a longing for beauty and wholeness. By offering citizens an endless array of petty delights. Okay, here we're talking about a society of spectacle. An array of petty delights, consumer societies eviscerate eros and sap the human soul of its elevating power. As advertisers are well aware, sex sells, and the perpetuation of the myth that we are still repressed Victorians plays nicely into the machinations of the market. Couple this with another myth that orgasm is
It's
the
a
most
Freudian slip there.
Slip.
This is why I want other people to talk, because my mouth gets dry and I start slurring. Couple this with another myth that orgasm is the most authentic experience, and we have a recipe for transforming the pursuit of happiness into the pursuit of the perfect climax. Such a serial of horizontal pursuit closes us off from transcending and integrating aspirations of eros. Here, what he's describing, again, is our society, but also what Nietzsche is starting to get at here is where all we now are engaged in is distractions, and like the distraction of pleasure. It elevates this kind of hedonism, where it's just, well, okay, nothing matters. Have fun. But what happens with that? Go.
Oh, I was just I'll let you finish out. You had a point
Let
to
me
get to.
drink for heaven's sake.
Okay. One thing I was going to say was sort of leapfrogging off of that is if you guys are familiar with Ovid's Metamorphosis, um, he in the Metamorphosis he talks about Pygmalion, and some of you guys may be familiar with Pygmalion from Bernard Shaw's musical of the same name. Or, sorry, it was a stage play and then it was adapted to a musical, I think. And then, of course, the film My Fair Lady. But, uh, what was my point? Oh, yeah, the thing about Pygmalion is that he is this sort of classic example of um, someone who, uh, sort of like Nietzsche or like the Nietzschean Übermensch, he's engaged in this kind of exaltation through creativity. Of course, Pygmalion's a sculptor, and he puts all his energy into sculpting the perfect woman. And so he sculpts the perfect, most beautiful woman of Pygmalion's energy and creative drive because what he ends up doing is just standing around wishing that his statue was a real woman. And he like dresses it up, he puts it in the bed with him, and it's this really strange story. And then finally, Venus gets frustrated with Pygmalion and shows up and turns the statue into a woman, and they, Pygmalion goes on and has children with the statue. So this is a way that the divine interposes into this horizontal pursuit, so to speak, and sort of forces it, channelizes it into something that has direction. So I think that's a poignant example of the kind of thing that modern people are engaged in. Is we're like Pygmalion with our with our statues dressed up in women's brasiers and sleeping with them in our beds, to use a weird analogy.
Just no, absolutely, I love that so much because what is that? It's a story on how like you would have thought about a problem like that in the old days. What's a solution for something like that where you're falling in love with an image, a simulacra, pure fantasy? Make it real. That's the solving for it. Return back to reality. Touch base with it instead of just living out these exercises of mere desire and fantasy. It's actually very beautifully and poignant. But then this last little bit here that's being outlined in terms of like a kind of consumeristic culture, like a society of spectacle and in hedonism, is that you have a problem of what Hibbs is calling here diminishing returns. Here he's kind of used example. I think his exact no, that's actually from Bethel. Okay, so what you have. Let me make sure I find it exactly.
I'm going to go ahead and because we're pretty close to the end, aren't we?
Oh yeah, just start questions. Yeah, start that, and I'll slip.
I'm gonna
last little bit.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and get questions rolling in the chat. If you've got questions, go ahead and start typing them in. We'll get to those right after Andrew is done with the last portion of the text. So, hopefully, questions related to what we've been talking about today, but we will. There's probably not enough of you that there'll be too many questions, so we can probably field everything you've got.
So dumb.
Yeah, unless they're dumb, then we won't field them.
I think I can just kind of feel this last little bit extemporaneously. So what you have with hedonism is a law of diminishing returns, where the pleasure starts to. It's sort of like the heroin problem. It starts to lose its edge, and this is what we would have to refer to as jouissance a little bit. Where if you have entirely permissiveness, especially in like the field of sexuality, you actually require a little bit of the transgression, a little bit of the taboo. If everything is just permissible, then everything's equal. It just becomes boring. So then what you have with nihilism is actually the flattening of even that, even though it's also proposing this kind of avenue for just for limit experiences or something. And then it goes on to quote Batial, who's actually the guy talking about limited experiences, is that if you're someone who's proposing this ideology of complete liberation, the complete liberation of the passions and the seeking out of sheer raw experience, but you don't actually find those limited experiences, like doing all kinds of just crazy stuff, then what Batial calls you is a bourgeois coward. Is that if this is what you're proposing, but then you don't do it, and instead you go back to your illusions before because, like, I don't know, you're scared or something. You're just a bourgeois coward. You're like the crazy guy in the ghetto putting heroin in his arm is more honest about it. But you're like sitting here, fine wines, and you're proposing this sort of corrosive and disgusting ideology, this philosophy that cannot be lived, or could be lived. It's just you're not brave enough to live it. You're just a hypocrite. And this is why I had to go back and say, like, the jouissance is, I'm using it as Jacques Lacan, where it's French for just pleasure in general, but in this usage is always something transgressive, where it's sort of like Augustine's in his Confessions talk about, why did I steal the apple? Because I wanted to. It just felt good to do something wrong. It's that kind of thing. But if you're proposing this sort of moral relativism, everything's flattened and like it was all bankrupt from the begin with, you lose even that. So the exercise of just sheer expressive consumption, yada yada yada, this hedonistic foray also disappears. You even shoot that in the foot.
You might also point out, in regards to the bourgeois cowards, is that we have, very real examples of this. I think of like the sociology around marriage, right? So you have all of these white liberal types, suburbanites, urbanites, who write for these newspapers and write for these magazines and publications, and are psychologists, and all of these people who prophesy the death of marriage, and bring about all these sociological changes in society that make marriage, that are systematically dismantling the institution of marriage. And if you look at those people, they have they
What are they doing?
they're getting they're getting married, they're having
Normal
children,
marriage,
right? They're having
son
children
and
in
daughter, white
wedlock,
picket
yeah.
fence.
And then you look at the rest of what they're leaving in their wake, right? And uh, it's just a good illustration.
Yeah, no, it's a great example of it. Fantastic.
But I does that play us out?
For that little bit, yeah, I'm perfectly happy with that. It's
All
a
right.
much broader thing to talk about, and maybe even deserves a stream of its own. But I just wanted to slip that last little bit in because I just love those little shots against hedonism, talking about the
Nothing.
transgressive pleasure that disappears and is sort of almost a driving force for certain things.
Well, I mean, hedonism, like anything else. I mean, I don't know if you know anything about methamphetamine, but being from the
A lot
South.
about it.
Oh well, being from the South, I know quite a bit about
I got some on my
methamphetamine.
table.
Um,
What do I got on my table here? Dextro amphetamine. Yeah, I have it in my hand. What are you kidding?
but I mean, that's the meth addict is sort of like the classic model of the hedonist. Or I guess actually the classic model is what the heroin addict, because I think heroin has that more like classic diminishing returns sort
Yeah,
of.
the first time is mind blowing, and then you're always chasing the dragon. It just keeps
Right.
going down and down, and then after a while, you're simply doing it to stave off the pain.
And I think this is why, and to tie this back into a stream I know we're going to do at some point, I think this is why sexual experiences and pornography in right wing circles
That's it.
is
You
a
know exactly why I want to talk about this.
yeah. Um, yeah, I understand the connection there, because it's the same kind of law of diminishing returns. Kind of, you have a high, and you've got to chase it, and you're like always trying to get a higher high, and well, like Hibbs says, like you're chasing the perfect orgasm. Okay, so we do have a question. Our first
It's
question.
it's from Blackjack, and it's someone I can cuss out.
Okay. Is the solution to LARP harder, or more clearly put, I hope, is the solution to LARP to take what you are idolizing and actually practice it? Is that point of the statue? Is HEMA the solution to actual LARP, essentially? What is HEMA? I don't know what that is.
Historical European martial arts. It's actually it's the actual restructuring of the combat styles that would have been used back in the Middle Ages or something, based off of manuals. Like people wrote
Well,
it down.
I don't know. Like, that is, I think the first portion of the question is kind of a good question. Is the solution just to LARP harder?
uh, this is actually a question that I like to handle a little bit, and this I show my colors here a little bit, and I like to say I don't like starting bar fights. I like to start uh, random fires. I don't like to start fight with specific people. But here's something that I'm actually sort of disgusted by. And this is more of a political problem in general, but it's where you start falling in love with the image, where you might get people like in our neck of the woods just want to go, oh, I just want to go back to the Middle Ages. They're falling in love with a family, with a fantasy.
You
A
should
singular
fall in love with your family.
yeah, you should, but but like it's this idealizing of a past that never existed. Like they look at pretty paintings and they go like, oh, what was it? They start engaging in this like putting themselves in baroque poses and delivering soliloquies on the woes of the culture kampf and it's nonsense. Effective there. You actually have to engage with the reality as it is, not simply go, something's wrong, I don't feel good, I want to escape into a fantasy, and then I want to impose my fantasy on the world.
Right.
But here, what we're talking about, as I understand, is talking about LARP. And in the case of, like, yes, the person who is just, the history nerd who's super interested in, like, combat from history. No, I do think it's actually something very good for them to actually experience that. Just as, like, a historian, to feel a little bit of what it's like to, like, get into, let's say, like, a phalanx and have someone smash into you. It gives you a little bit of perspective. And that's just a little methodological thing that I like.
Well, I think
But
there's something.
then it's a kind of like it's a little bit more honest.
I think there's something helpful about LARP in moderate doses or small doses is that it is a good idea to try to understand maybe a little bit of what people were like at another point in time. I think the part of the problem with the modern condition is that there's almost like a time horizon somewhere amorphously in like the 16th or 15th century that just drops, and all of a sudden we have no idea what life. We have a hard time reconstructing what life was like beyond that event horizon. So I think there's something useful in trying to, in some sense, retrace the steps of the people who lived before. Not to romanticize the 13th century or to say that everything was hunky dory because feudal peasants worked less hours or whatever those memes are about wage slavery and feudal peasants. But um, I think it is helpful to try to get that kind of perspective and try to beat the time horizon problem, essentially.
Or you have people going like, oh, we just need to go back to the 50s, and I go, no, go back further. Figure that
Further.
out too. Further, all the way back, like 1700s. No, further.
Evan says the solution to LARP is to get a DM to run the story and make it fun. I would
Exactly.
I would say our DM is God, and we just gotta. we're,
Oh, come on. I was gonna go. It's just like our DM is just like a number crunching nerd. It's just like the game is always just like it's just running numbers. Like, give us the wild DM. Like, well, might as well have a good time.
well, that's what happened, right? That's what the end of history is. The wild DM stepped out, and we just the nerdy number crunch
The
DM.
dynamic DM steps out, and then the new DM just wants you to file your taxes on time. And you just go, okay.
Blackjack would argue that the horizon is probably 1914 or later. See, I'm not too sure. Maybe. It certainly is the case that people. I don't know if people can't understand the Victorians, but it certainly is the case that people have no idea what the Victorians were like. Me included. But um,
It's only brought up to talk about Victorian like repression.
right. That's all that's ever spoken about. And I guess really that just comes from Freud, who is working from a very small sample size.
Freud's a character that requires. Uh, let me just put it this way: first year psychology is basically say, yeah, this guy's an asshole. He doesn't really know what he's talking about. We only bring him up to tell him that he's wrong, but we have to talk about him to kind of designate a certain history and genealogy. Okay, we now quickly move on. It's like you talk about him for like maybe 30 minutes.
That's all he's worth, really.
Yeah, Blackjack, I think, is using LARP in a very, at least when I say LARP, I'm using it in a very derisive manner. It's the kind of it's like play acting, but I'm meant to take you seriously.
Now, one thing I do want to say about LARP, and this is actually something I said a really long time ago on my channel, is that if you mean LARP in the sense of like, see, I think you can take LARP in the sense of fake it till you make it, in the sense of there are gestures and motions that you can go throughout the day that orient you towards some sort of greater truth. So, for example, like um, the a good example is like uh, you know, um, doing the what's it called? Doing the divine office or something like that. Some common everyday prayers where through this daily repetitive exercise you're orienting yourself towards something greater than yourself. It's kind of a LARP in the sense of like it's something you're self-consciously doing and taking upon yourself, but it's not just like you're play acting. It's play acting, but it's like directed towards something. um, I don't know.
That
Maybe
I would not want to use what I would consider a dirty word to describe habituation, and it is a very good and normal like uh, system of development.
well, what I mean to say
Like
is that
I'm
there
talking about
is
something a little bit more narrow.
yeah. All I guess I mean to say is that you can apply it to a kind of the idea that outward signs can manifest an inward change, so to speak, or an inward transformation. So, an example that's not religious, for example, is that um, if people LARP traditional marriage, so to speak, um, if people put themselves in the motions of traditional marriage, I know that sounds weird, but I think everyone kind of has a concept of what I'm talking about. It makes it easier to actually do the thing. I mean, not like
So
if
a bit
you're
of a
already
fake it till you make it attitude.
yeah, it. Well, and here's the thing: people deride "fake it till you make it," but I genuinely believe that "fake it till you make it" is a real thing.
It can, but it is habituation, and blackjack is using the way I'm talking about it as I don't mean it fake it till you make it. I mean taking yourself seriously while not behaving seriously, like those nerds beating each other with phone swords in the park. So we all know people like this.
Correct.
That is like here I'm just like I'm beating my chest talking about like we need to return to the nobler times and just oh woe is me, but then you just sit there playing video games all day and you're like what are you doing? It's like you're
Right.
talking a big game and there's just nothing on the other side of it. You're proposing. You're trying to project your fantasy on me. Yeah, you want the world to resemble your own internal LARP.
So we are technically over time. So if there are any
Time with
other,
social construct. I don't care about those.
so if we are any,
Some Anglo British nonsense. Get it out of here.
if there are any other questions in the chat, I'm gonna wait another, 20, 30 seconds for them to pop up. And if nothing else comes up, I'm more than happy to close it here. We've well past the 2 hour mark.
Dude, I'm way past my bedtime.
Well,
Franzel, I can hear you falling asleep in the background. Just go if you need to. It's
yeah,
like 3 a.m. for you.
yeah, you can just pop out.
I think I can stay on for, but
All right.
who
Well,
knows sleep? Who needs it?
well,
There you go, you're dead.
everybody give props to Franzel for staying up at like 3 in the morning to listen to Andrew's inane rants.
No, he does that. He does that in other voice chats already. That's not. Don't give him a medal for that.
They're fairly fascinating rants going through it.
Like fascinating, like the guy at the zoo who's screaming about how the anteater is talking to him. Yeah, okay. I know what you mean by that.
But thank you, because I have no background in film, so we needed somebody who had a background in film.
Well, background in film sounds incredibly fancy. Watch a couple.
You've seen movies, is what I mean to say, which neither of us have done. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any questions pop up, so I think we're going to call it here, fellas.
Okay.
So, at any rate, this concludes the Canis Society live stream for April 4th, 2020. I hope you all have a great rest of the evening. If you're coming in late, remember that Dave the Distributist will be streaming with Settler's Lament and Charlemagne at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time, which is in 55 minutes, so you can catch that right after this stream. Thank you guys for tuning in. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and God bless.
God bless.